Well, welcome to the Jacob Hornberger Show. I'm president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is my weekly show on the internet. Uh, did y'all happen to catch the front page of the New York Times today? This is quite incredible. The title of the article in the left-hand column is U.S. Agencies See No Move by Iran to Build a Bomb. And it starts out by saying, even as the UN's nuclear watchdog said in a new report Friday that Iran has accelerated its uranium enrichment program, American intelligence analysts continue to believe there is no hard evidence that Iran has decided to build a nuclear bomb. Recent assessments by American spy agencies are broadly consistent with a 2007 intelligence finding that concluded that Iran had abandoned its nuclear weapons program years earlier, according to current and former officials. The officials said that assessment was largely reaffirmed in a 2010 National Intelligence Estimate and that it remains the consensus view of America's 16 intelligence agencies. That's incredible. I mean, because you've got all these politicians, on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, all the pro-interventionists, the pro-empire people, the pro-militarists that are out there screaming that Iran's about to drop a nuclear bomb on some American city and we're going to see a mushroom cloud. All the same nonsense that we heard with Saddam Hussein, right? Well, but I mean, here you have the CIA, all the national intelligence agencies saying, no, there's no evidence of that at all. So what are they really saying? The interventionists, the Obamites and the Romneyites and the Gingrichites and the Santorumites, they're saying, let's just go bomb just to be safe, just so we can feel safe. Let's go in there and start bombing people, killing families, children. I mean, how many people were killed in Iraq? We don't even know because they wouldn't keep count of them. They said they didn't count. They weren't important enough that we only have to keep track of American dead. And that was, of course, after, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children had been killed with the sanctions. So, I mean, what's this all about? Well, it's clearly the same thing that Iraq was all about. It's regime change. I mean, that's been a core element of U.S. foreign policy since the time of the national security state founding, 1947. That you oust recalcitrant dictators, you replace them with pro-U.S. dictators. I mean, that's what they did with Iran in '53. They ousted a democratically elected president. They installed a dictator. A dictator brutalized the people. The CIA helped train his secret police force, torture, oppression, lack of due process, indefinite detention, until finally, the Iranian people rebelled and threw him out. And that's really the heart of the problem on this. If the U.S. government had not attacked Iran in 1953, and that's what it was an attack. When you go into a country and you instigate a coup that puts in a dictator, that's an attack. And I mean, they destroyed their experiment with democracy, and so here, we're still living with the aftermath of this, and U.S. officials hate it. They want another Shah in there, and so that's what this is all about. They say, "Oh, Iran's going to attack us. Iran's going to attack." I mean, they've got Iran surrounded. I mean, is it any wonder that Iran might want a nuclear bomb? Maybe that would be the only thing that would dissuade the U.S. from attacking or instigating another coup there. But that's what it's all about. I mean, Saddam Hussein, and they said the same thing. Oh, he's insane. He's irrational. He's an aggressor. He's the new Hitler and stuff. They partnered with the guy. I mean, throughout the 1980s, they partnered with him. And then they expect people to just, forget about that. And people do forget. All of a sudden, throughout the 90s, you didn't hear anything about the communist threat, well, because the Cold War had ended. And you didn't hear anything about the Muslims, like you hear today. It was all Saddam, Hussein, please help us get Saddam. And Saddam was the obsession. Well, the point of all this, really, in the larger scheme of things, is this climate of perpetual crisis under which we live. This is not normal. This is not a regular way to live life. But give me a period of time for since the founding of the national security state when there has been a period in which there wasn't preparation for war, a major crisis, a national security threat, an unsafe world. In other words, all the things to justify the national security state itself. And not to mention the fact that they produce many of the crises. Like this coup in Iran that ends up producing a big crisis 25 years later. Or their partnership with brutal dictators. I mean, it's it's ironic that they're over there exclaiming against Syria. The Syrian dictatorship, headed by Assad. We've got to get rid of him. And well, they partnered with the guy. I mean, he's the guy that tortured that Canadian citizen, Maher Arar, after the CIA delivered him to that country. He was a Canadian citizen. They delivered him to Syria after kidnapping him at Dulles Airport. They didn't take him before a judge. They took him into Syria because they'd form a partnership, a torture partnership with the Assad regime. And now they're saying, oh, well, he's just too brutal. He's just too brutal. That's why they chose him to be the torture partner, because he is brutal. He was brutal. I mean, this is the type of thing that we've lived under, crises, dictatorships, partnerships, torture, rendition, Cold War, perpetual crises, terrorism, Muslims. I mean, this is not normal, and it not coincidentally, you have ever increasing military budgets. Massive military budgets are growing, every year. I was reading today where our government spends on military more than all the other nations combined. I mean, feeling safe yet? I mean, this is ridiculous. But that's the coin of the realm. I mean, the Roman Empire was really good at this, is that in order to keep people, funneling their hard-earned money to serve the state, to funnel all this money to provide for the bureaucracies and the military and so forth and all the overseas bases, they have to have crises. They have to have perpetual war, perpetual preparation for war. Madison pointed out that the Romans were great at this, that whenever there was a hint of a tax revolt, because people have to pay for this junk, with their taxes, and whenever there was a hint of that, the Roman Empire, the Roman emperors and stuff would go out and start some crisis with the German barbarians, or they're attacking in France, the empire's under siege, and of course everybody would rally to the troops and support the troops. Well, it was all just a trick. It was a trick to garner support for a permanent giant military establishment, an empire. Overseas troops everywhere, and people were taught, you feel glorious that you're part of an empire, and it's no way to live. Now, how do we approach things like this? Well, conservatives will talk about the $1 million, ranch or toilet seat or whatever, and they'll get all upset about it and talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. But as libertarians, what we really need to be doing is we need to be continuing to raise people's vision to a higher level. And what does that mean here? Well, it means get rid of this empire way of life. Dismantle all the overseas bases, bring all the troops home. Cold War is over. Europe, Germany, Korea, they have to handle their own problems there, and they might very well work them out without the U.S. there. Vietnam, no, we don't. I guess we don't have any troops in Vietnam anymore, thankfully. But everywhere, Cuba, Guantanamo, Latin America, bring them all home and discharge them. And then start working on the bases here at home. I mean, this is ridiculous. They're like forts, Forts are, in the old West, we're a fort to protect the city. That's what these bases are for. I mean, we're going to protect the cities. From what? I mean, there's no nation on earth that has the military capability or the money. Everybody's broker than the U.S. government is to cross the oceans with the logistics that would be necessary to invade and occupy the country. It's just not going to happen. And all they're doing over there with those bases and invasions and occupations, they're the ones stirring up the anger and hatred. Look at Afghanistan, where they just burned all those Korans. I mean, if they don't know that you're not supposed to burn a Koran after 10 years of occupying the country, it's time to bring them home. I mean, get out of the country. Leave those people alone. They had to suffer under Russian Soviet occupation, and now they have to suffer under U.S. empire occupation. I mean, leave them alone. 10 years under our occupation. I don't know how long were the Soviets there, 7 or 8 years. Leave them alone. Just bring them home. And then you eliminate the terrorist threat against the United States. The anger and the rage starts dissipating. You're not burning Korans anymore over there and so forth. You're not killing wedding parties. You're not killing children. Just bring them home. And then, dismantle this military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about, that he warned us about, that were a threat to our democratic processes, that were a threat to our liberties. We've got the out-of-control spending and debt that's leading our nation into a very precarious situation. I mean, we don't know at some point when this debt is going to create a major catastrophe like it has in Greece. But one thing we do know, it's going to happen as things progress. We just don't know when. And a major part of this is the military-industrial complex, all the contractors. Look how they distorted our economic affairs in this country. I mean, look what a major part of private industry, private companies are out there serving the state, with coffee machines and candy and sandwiches and all the supplies, soft drinks and so forth that go into serving the military machine. It's not necessary. You see, this is what we libertarians have to do. We have to continue raising people's vision to a higher level instead of trying to reform it and getting rid of the waste, fraud, and abuse. Talk about a free and peaceful society where you liberate the private sector, you get rid of the sanctions and the embargoes, starting with this ridiculous one against Cuba that has caused so much suffering that among the Cuban people, that its only focus, its only mission is regime change. I mean, they can't get over that Fidel Castro would not, bow to their wishes. That was what it was all about. Notice that was always a big crisis. I mean, if Iran wasn't a crisis, Cuba could be a crisis. Because all they got to do is start stirring things up like they did with Iran, like they did with Iraq. They could stir up a crisis with North Korea, with Venezuela. You can always stir up a crisis when you've got the military forces and the CIA to do that. So that they had crises in the early 60s with Cuba and Castro and the communists, and the communists are coming to get us, and we have to have a Bay of Pigs invasion, and we have to have Operation Mongoose, where we have to have an assassination program. Imagine assassinating a guy just because he's a communist. And it's all considered good and moral because, the national security state is good and moral. Even when they adopt the methods of the communists, torture, assassination, it's considered good, you see, because they're the ones that are doing it. Well, okay, so Cold War's over. I don't see, Castro invading Miami. In fact, he never invaded Miami. Oh, he got a guy in Nicaragua. He got a guy in Venezuela. He got, who else? No, Bolivia, whatever. Who cares? I mean, do you see America falling to the communists? I mean, this was part of this all perpetual crisis nonsense. So what we need to be talking about is not just reforming it and making them give up a bomber plane or something like that. Dismantling the military-industrial complex, dismantling the standing army. Our founding fathers warned us about standing armies. And then liberate the American people to trade, travel, and interact with the people of the world. Now, what do conservatives say about us libertarians? They say, "Oh, you libertarians, you talk about your ideals, but you're on top of a mountain." I forget exactly what they say, but it goes something like this: "You're on top of a mountain, and nobody's listening to you. So we have to be practical. So come down from the mountain, and get among the people, and accept the statism, and then just figure out ways to reform and save the statism." Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, if that's all your life is, you want your life to be devoted to is reforming statism and saving statism, fine. But we libertarians are about something more. We want to change America for the better. We want a paradigm shift. And when they say, "Oh, well, people aren't listening," they don't know that. And for one thing, if nobody advocates these ideals, then it's a foregone conclusion that you will never achieve them. And so, you just live under imperialism and militarism and perpetual crisis and perpetual war and perpetual preparation for. You just live like that. And but keep in mind that the great things that were achieved in life with respect to liberty, religious liberty. I mean, at one time the state controlled religious activity everywhere, and some guy comes along and says, I'm going to start arguing for religious liberty. Well, the conservatives of that time would have said, you're on a mountaintop, nobody's listening to you, forget it. Come on down with us and try to reform the system, make the state control and regulation better, more efficient, more fair, more just, more moral. And the guy said, no. If nobody listens to me, nobody listens to me. But, so he goes on the mountaintop or wherever he goes, but people do listen. They respond to ideals and they respond to principles, and lo and behold, not everybody's got religious liberty in the world, but we do. And that's because there were people, or one guy starts it, and then all of a sudden others hear the idea and they start spreading it. And that's why we have to maintain our ideals. We have to be true to ourselves as libertarians. We can't become like the statists, like conservatives and liberals. Let them argue within their statist box and how to reform the system, how to make it better. But we libertarians got to stand above the fray and argue for an entire new paradigm. Let me give you another example of this. I very rarely listen to conservative talk radio, or liberal talk radio for that matter. I mean, to me, it's just so boring. I mean, it is just absolutely boring because it's so predictable. I mean, the host is going to come up, well, on the conservative talk shows, they'll talk about, oh, well, we're free enterprise, and we got to get rid of Obama. Got to get rid of Obama. I mean, I love to hear that one. Oh, it's imperative. Oh my gosh, if we don't get rid of Obama, the nation's lost. Well, like, what's the difference? I mean, so it's Romney or Santorum or Gingrich. What's the difference? I mean, they ought to be happy that Obama's continued everything George W. Bush was doing. I mean, what's the problem? I mean, it seems to me that on all the war on terrorism, junk, the foreign policy, that it's all part of this overall paradigm of statism. And really what the charade is, who's going to get to run it? Who's going to have their boys and their friends and their cronies in office? Who's going to get the bailouts? Who's going to get the largesse? That's really what it's all about. But and anyway, I decided to listen in on some of these radio talk shows in the past week. I was kind of curious as to whether they'd gotten less boring over the years, And one of them was talking about meals in public schools. I mean, I thought, well, this is going to be boring. And sure enough, it was boring, but I stuck it out because I was fascinated that they have this huge segment, I don't know, an hour or something, arguing over whether parents ought to be feeding their children or whether the government ought to be feeding the children through the state. And man, they had callers calling in and saying, I think parents should take responsibility for this. And the talk show host would say, yeah, this is parental responsibility. This is what freedom and responsibility are all about. And then they'd have other people calling in and say, well, I can't afford it. I need my children to be fed. And so I'm really happy that the state is providing free breakfast and free lunch. And I'm not making too much money. And I wish they'd provide dinner. And I mean, this went on for, I really think it was about an hour. I mean, it was like, I almost fell asleep at the wheel. I wonder if I could have sued them if I'd fallen asleep, for just sheer boredom. Because they couldn't see, they had this blind spot, what the crux of the problem is. I mean, they couldn't understand that the problem is not with what meals are being served in school, it's what role does government have in education at all? You see, but their minds don't let them go that way because they're stuck in the statist box. They can't break out of the statist box. So they have all these arguments about how to make the public schools work. And, and one of them will say, one of those candidates will say, I'm in favor of abolishing the Department of Education. And, man, everybody cheers, Federal Department of Education. I mean, it's their favorite little line they use. They're never going to do it. I mean, as soon as the person's elected, nothing's gonna change, okay? Unless Ron Paul was elected up. But he's a libertarian. Let's just set that example aside. that nothing's going to change. But even notwithstanding that, they rarely say, well, what about the State Board of Education? Oh, they always go to the 10th Amendment. Well, I think the states ought to be involved. You're doing this. I don't think the federal government. But that doesn't really address the freedom issue. Is why should the state be involved in education at all? And this is what conservatives can't confront. In fact, this is one of the reasons why they favor vouchers. Because you see, they call this the free enterprise approach to education. Vouchers. I mean, what are vouchers? Vouchers are where the state takes money from one person and gives it to another person in the form of a voucher that he takes to a private school. So this is a state-managed program. And conservatives say, this is free enterprise. And they teach their children it's free enterprise. I mean, it's just a lie. It's a welfare program. It's a welfare program for people that want to send their kids to private schools. And conservatives say, well, it's better. It's better. Well, it's not necessarily better. I mean, they're putting all these private schools on the dole. So, and some of them say, well, it's a gradual system. It'll gradually get rid of public schools. But they say it real quietly so nobody will hear them because they don't want to be considered radical, And but once you put all these schools on vouchers, what's the chance of them saying we need to end the voucher system? Nil. And let's assume it worked. Do you think all these conservatives would say, hey, we need to abolish it now and get rid of all state schooling? Of course not. But that's the difference between libertarians and conservatives. They're enmeshed in their little statist system, and they argue over the liberals, whether should the meals be provided, should they not be provided, and boring. When the real solution is a total separation of education and the state. Now, the conservative would say, but Jacob, you're on a mountaintop, and nobody's listening to you. I mean, it's ridiculous. What's the point of calling for educational liberty if nobody's going to listen to you? Well, for one thing, because you don't know if anybody's listening. Again, educational liberty is no different from religious liberty. I mean, if we don't have the state involved in religion, if we don't have the state being forced to send their kids, the state doesn't force parents to send their kids to church every Sunday or to Sunday school or to daily religious training, why should the state be involved in sending the kids to some state institution for non-religious training? We just apply the principle the same. A total separation of education and the state. Get rid of all the state buildings, sell them off, donate them, whatever. No more school taxes. Everybody takes responsibility for educating their children the way they take responsibility for feeding them, except for those, state breakfasts, which would no longer exist. But now you got all the money from the taxes that they take from you. And then you've got no more taxes, school taxes, no more state textbooks, none of all that rigmarole, that bureaucracy. And then parents can decide for themselves how to educate their children, what to feed their children. I mean, the reason that people are so impoverished, see, this is what they don't realize. That when they say, "Oh, we're going to elect a president that's going to bring us jobs," they're electing a job creator. And the conservatives are really good. This is another boring part where they say, they have this big debate over whether, Romney or Gingrich or Santorum will be the better job creator. And, they'll say, well, Romney's a businessman. He knows how to create jobs. And I mean, it's just ludicrous. Why should the government be involved in the creation of jobs? I mean, why are we electing a job creator? It's ridiculous. But it's because if their mind is stuck in the statist box where the government manages the economy and it creates jobs and prosperity and so forth, well, then their mind is going to be stuck there. We say this is not a proper role of government in a society, any more than it is in education, religion. Government has no business managing an economy. And the reason that there's so much impoverishment is because the government's so involved in people's lives and pocketbooks. I mean, you've got you've got the whole military spending, right? Okay, that's all that money taken out of the private sector. You got all the welfare state spending, not just on the federal aid to education, but you got all the Social Security, the Medicare, the Medicaid, the education grants, the farm subsidies, the foreign aid to dictators, the dictatorship in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and all the rest, Jordan and all the rest of them. I mean, all this money, and then the debt. I mean, because they don't want to collect the amount of taxes necessary to fund all this junk, because people are going to get mad when their taxes are raised, so they just go out and borrow the money. Well, great. They borrow the money, and the debt keeps getting higher and higher. Who do you think's going to have to pay off that debt? Yes, you. I mean, and it may be done just through the inflation tax when they just start printing the money, and that's obviously what they're getting geared up to do. Um, that's why you've got this huge level of impoverishment where people are struggling. This is not normal. This is not a prospering society. And when they say, well, but yeah, if you put my man in, he'll be a job creator. It's ridiculous. It's a systemic problem. Their system's bad. Their welfare state system's bad. Their warfare state system's bad. And we libertarians have to keep talking to people about a paradigm shift where we dismantle, we separate economy in the state. We separate education in the state. We separate health care in the state. We separate immigration in the state. In other words, all these crises, they're government caused. They're systemic. They're part of the system, of the welfare state system, the warfare state system, the terrorist crisis, the immigration crisis, the education crisis, the healthcare crisis, the Social Security crisis, the income tax problem. I mean, it's all the unemployment crisis. It's all part and parcel of their system, and all the chickens are now coming home to roost. So what we libertarians have to continue doing is raising people's vision to a higher level. Let's not do what conservatives do. Oh, well, we need to have people listening to us, so we need to just get down in the muck and talk about how to reform public schooling and whether there should be uniforms in public schools or meals in public schools, and oh, well, should there be Social Security IRAs, and should there be health care savings accounts, and leave all that reform to the conservatives. Now, they might make it better. I don't think so. I think once you start intervening, you just keep getting worse and worse and worse. And forget the liberals. I mean, they're just dyed-in-the-wool socialists. I mean, the conservatives are right about that. They're dyed-in-the-wool socialists. They believe government should be managing the economy, managing education, managing healthcare, just like they do in Cuba, where people, not surprisingly, are suffering in North Korea. I mean, the places where people do better is where the state does these things to a lesser degree. But I'm not arguing that the state should regulate and control and subsidize education to a lesser extent, or healthcare to a lesser extent. I'm saying just end it. Separate economy in the state, separate education in the state. These are our ideals. These are our principles. And if we keep looking for people that respond positively to these principles, we keep building up our numbers until we hopefully reach a critical mass that then just shifts society into our direction. But if we don't expound these ideas, if we fall for the conservative trap of saying, oh, well, nobody's going to listen to us, nobody's going to then obviously it's a foregone conclusion. You can't achieve genuine freedom unless you're talking about it. You have to be expounding these ideas. And sure, is it difficult to convince people? Absolutely, because they're mired in the status box. They want to be taken care of by government. But the way I figure it is, we ought to spend less our time trying to convince people and more of our time just trying to find people that agree with us and maybe don't know that there's a whole movement of people that believe in this philosophy. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many times I've heard people say, gosh, where y'all been? I've believed this all my life, but I didn't know there was a whole movement on this. Well, now the movement is getting closer to critical mass. I'm convinced of it because, I mean, most everyone's heard of libertarianism now. They may not know all the ins and outs and principles, but now they know about it. It's on the table. It's being debated. It's being discussed. Now's the time, more than ever, that we got to stick with our principles, because this is the way we're going to achieve freedom, by sticking with our principles, our ideas, and then attracting people and finding people who agree with us with that aim of reaching the critical mass that then shifts society to a free system, and it may happen very quickly. I mean, very few people predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall. It happened very quickly. It happened peacefully, and suddenly, and hardly anyone expected it. So that's the show. Thank you very much for listening in, and come and visit us at fff.org. If you're not subscribing to our daily FFF email update, I'd like to invite you to do so. If you're not supporting the foundation with some donations, I'd like to invite you to do that too. And thank you very much for listening in. I'll see you next week. Bye.